They laughed when a father and son started building their own house by hand. But when the storm hit, they ran to that same house for help. Watch how hard work and faith turned mockery into respect. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Morning came softly over Maple Hollow, washing the hills of Tennessee in a slow, honey-colored light that seemed to stretch lazily over the dew-soaked grass. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, a mixture that spoke of old forests and quiet rivers. Down a gravel road, an aging copper-colored pickup rattled its way through the mist, its engine coughing softly, its bed filled with tools, planks, and the scent of sawdust. Behind the wheel sat Jack Miller, a man of 50, whose hands looked as if they'd been carved from oak-scarred, strong, deliberate in every movement. Next to him, his 12-year-old son, Evan, sat upright with that kind of careful stillness that boys learn from fathers they admire. He held a thermos on his lap and glanced out the window at the woods sliding past. It was too early for most. But for the Millers, this was when the day began. They didn't talk much on the drive. Between them lay a comfortable silence, filled only by the hum of the motor and the low murmur of a country station playing through the crackling radio. Jack occasionally tapped the steering wheel in rhythm with the music, though he never sang. His voice, like everything about him, was measured used only when needed. Evan had long since learned to read meaning in his father's silences. A nod could mean pride. A sigh could mean worry. A half smile was approval. The truck turned off the main road and rolled into a construction site at the edge of town, where the faint shape of a half-built house stood against the fog. They had been working here for 2 weeks, building a modest home for an aging schoolteacher who'd saved every penny for it. The job was simple, but Jack treated it with the same care he would a mansion. Every joint, every nail had to be right. He didn't believe in shortcuts. Evan followed his example, watching his father's every move, how he measured twice before cutting, how he wiped the blade before setting it down, how he checked the spirit level with an almost ritual calm. "Don't rush the cut," Jack said finally, handing his son the saw. "Let the wood tell you where it wants to split." Evan nodded and started to work. The saw bit into the plank with a slow, steady rhythm. He was strong for his age, but what he lacked in strength, he made up for in patience. When the piece came clean off, Jack inspected it, ran a thumb along the edge, and gave one of those quiet smiles that said more than words could. By noon, the sun had burned through the haze, turning the air hot and heavy. They ate lunch sitting on a stack of boards under a patch of shade. Jack's thermos still smelled faintly of coffee. Evan's sandwich had gone warm in the foil. The boy chewed thoughtfully, watching a hawk circle high above the trees. "Dad," he said after a moment, "how come we never build for ourselves?" Jack looked at him, squinting against the sun. "We will," he said after a pause. "One day. When? When we've earned it." The boy frowned slightly, but didn't push. He had learned that his father's "one day" always meant more than it seemed. Like a promise carved into stone, the day dragged on into afternoon, then into the deep gold of evening. When the tools were packed and the truck was loaded, they drove home along the dirt road, dust rising behind them like smoke. Their trailer sat in a quiet hollow at the edge of town, surrounded by oak trees and the sound of crickets. It was small, just one bedroom, a kitchenette, and a couch that doubled as Evan's bed. But it was neat, every tool and picture in its place. On the wall above the table hung a single photograph, a woman with warm eyes and chestnut hair, smiling as she held a much younger Evan by the shoulders. She had died 6 years ago, but her presence filled the space, as if she'd only stepped out for a moment. Jack never spoke of her much, though sometimes, when he thought the boy was asleep, Evan would hear him whisper her name. That night, as they sat outside with mugs of coffee and cocoa, the sky over Maple Hollow stretched clear and endless. Fireflies drifted over the grass, their soft light blinking like the pulse of a heartbeat. Evan leaned back against the steps, listening to the night sounds, the far-off bark of a dog, the hum of frogs from the creek, the faint rustle of wind through trees. "Dad? You think Mom would have liked this house?" Jack took a sip of coffee. "She would have said it needs curtains," he replied, and Evan smiled. It was the kind of answer that meant yes. The next morning came earlier than usual. Jack got a call just after sunrise, his deep voice low as he spoke to someone on the other end. When he hung up, he sat for a long moment, staring out the window. "Get your gloves," he said finally. "We've got a new job." The address led them to the other side of town, past the old mills, and into the richer part of Maple Hollow, where the lawns were clipped short and the houses had wide porches and white columns. A silver SUV waited near the gate of a lakeside property. The man who stepped out wore a pressed shirt and carried himself with quiet authority. "Mr. Miller?" he asked, extending a hand. "Howard Collins. I hear you're the man to call when someone wants something built to last." Jack shook his hand firmly. "We do what we can." Collins smiled. "That's what I like to hear. I'm building a guest house for my daughter. Needs to be small, simple, but done right." "You and your boy interested?" Jack nodded. "We're always interested in good work." Collins gestured toward the lake, where the foundation had already been poured. "You'll have everything you need here. Just do it your way. I've seen your houses around town." He paused. "They stand out, not because they're big, but because they stand." And that was how it began. Over the next several weeks, the Millers worked at the Collins property from dawn till dusk. The view of the lake was almost too beautiful to believe. Clear water glinting between tall pines, the reflection of the sky shifting from silver to amber each evening. Collins visited often, usually with a cup of coffee in one hand and quiet curiosity in his eyes. He'd stand back, watching Jack and Evan work in silence. The boy never complained, even when the days stretched long and his arms ached from lifting boards. He wanted to prove himself to his father, to the man watching, maybe even to the memory of his mother. Once, Collins asked Jack, "How long have you been teaching him?" "Since he could walk," Jack answered. "He learned to hammer nails before he learned to write his name." Collins laughed softly. "You don't see that kind of thing much anymore." Jack didn't reply. He was fitting a beam into place, eyes narrowed, hands sure. Evan stood nearby, passing him tools without being asked. They worked like two halves of the same rhythm, one steady, one eager. By the time autumn rolled in, the house by the lake was finished. It wasn't large, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. The cedar siding shone golden in the light, and the porch overlooked the quiet water, where geese often landed at dusk. When Collins stepped inside, he said nothing for a long while. He just ran his hand along the smooth wood of the banister and nodded. "You built this?" he asked Evan, though the question was meant for them both. Evan hesitated. "With my dad." Collins smiled, a rare warmth touching his features. "I can see that." He invited them inside, poured coffee, and for the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to sit still for a moment, to admire something not for its perfection, but for what it meant. It was proof that honest work could still speak louder than any title or diploma. When they finished, Collins disappeared into another room and returned with a large brown envelope. He placed it on the table in front of Jack. "I wanted to pay you fair," he said, "but money isn't always the right way to say thank you." Jack frowned, pushing the envelope back. "We've already been paid." Collins smiled slightly. "Then humor me." Jack opened it reluctantly. Inside were folded papers deed documents. He read the name once, then again, hardly believing. It's a small piece of land, Collins explained. Down by Haven Creek. Used to be an old mill there years ago. I've been sitting on it, not knowing what to do. Figured a man like you might. Jack stared at him, speechless. For a man who spent his life building homes for others, the idea of land, his own land, was something sacred. I can't accept this, he said finally. You can, Collins replied gently. You've earned it. I've seen a lot of builders, Mr. Miller. Most just want a paycheck. You build because you care. That's rare these days. For a long time, Jack said nothing. He just sat there, his rough hands resting on the table, the papers trembling slightly between them. Evan, sitting beside him, looked from his father to Collins with wide eyes, as if witnessing a miracle. That evening, when they drove out to see the land, the sky was painted with streaks of red and orange. The creek shimmered under the fading light, winding through a small valley surrounded by birch and oak. The ground was uneven, wild with grass, but the air smelled clean and full of promise. Jack parked the truck and stepped out. He stood there for a long while, hands on his hips, scanning the horizon. Evan followed quietly, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The only sound was the rush of water and the distant cry of a heron. So, this is it? Evan asked. This is it, Jack said softly. He knelt down, grabbed a handful of soil, let it crumble through his fingers. Good ground. Evan smiled. Can we build here? Jack looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, his eyes held something lighter than fatigue. Yeah, son, he said. We can build here. As the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the field, father and son stood together, already seeing the shape of walls that didn't yet exist, the outline of a porch that would one day hold their chairs, the faint heartbeat of a home rising from the quiet earth. They stayed until the stars appeared, the land around them humming with night sounds, as if the world itself approved. When they finally climbed back into the truck, Evan looked out the window, unable to stop smiling. What are we going to call it? He asked. Jack thought for a moment, then said simply, Ours. The truck rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the darkness as they drove back toward town. Behind them, Haven Creek whispered softly through the trees, carrying with it the promise of something that had been a lifetime in the making. And though neither spoke of it aloud, both knew the truth. This was more than land. It was a beginning. They didn't see it yet, but that night marked the start of everything that would follow. The laughter, the doubt, the storm, the change. All of it was waiting there, beneath the same stars that now glimmered over the hills of Maple Hollow, over the hands of a man and his son who believed that anything built with patience and love could stand against time itself. The first light of spring spilled across the hills of Maple Hollow like melted gold. Along the edge of Haven Creek, the new plot of land stood quiet, still carrying the scent of winter rain. The ground was uneven, overgrown with weeds and bits of stone from the old mill that had once stood there decades before. But to Jack and Evan Miller, it was beautiful. It was a beginning. The week after Howard Collins had given them the deed, they packed up their trailer and moved it closer to the property. Jack parked the old pickup near the creek and built a small canopy where they could keep their tools dry. Evan brought out a coffee tin filled with nails, a hammer, and 2 small pieces of chalk to mark their first lines on the soil. The boy had never looked prouder. Jack walked the perimeter, measuring with slow, deliberate steps. His boots sank slightly in the damp ground. Every few yards he stopped to study the horizon, the direction of the sun, the way the land sloped toward the water. He wasn't a man who needed blueprints. He carried plans in his head. Evan followed him silently, mimicking his father's habit of squinting when he looked at the ground. We'll start here, Jack said finally, planting a small wooden stake into the soil. "Front porch, facing the water. You'll see the sunrise from your room." Evan grinned and nodded. He imagined it. The golden light spilling through a window, the sound of the creek, the smell of fresh pine boards. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was real. They began working that very day. The first week was nothing but clearing. The land was stubborn, as if testing their determination. They cut down thick weeds, hauled away broken stones, and dug up old roots. Their hands blistered, their backs ached, but each evening they stood a little taller. When dusk came, they sat on the truck's tailgate, drinking cold water and watching the sun fade behind the trees. It became a rhythm. Work, eat, rest, repeat. The neighbors noticed them almost immediately. Haven Creek Drive wasn't a place where people built their own homes anymore. The houses that lined the street were modern and sleek white columns, trimmed lawns, glistening windows that reflected money more than warmth. The Millers' arrival broke that perfect image like a smudge on polished glass. The first to make their disapproval known was Brian Hall, a lawyer with a shiny new truck and a yard that looked more like a museum piece than a place where kids could play. He stood on his porch the first morning, watching the Millers unload their lumber. When Jack waved, Brian only lifted an eyebrow and went back inside. Next came Jessica Gray, a real estate agent with a permanent smile that never reached her eyes. She was friendly enough at first, until she saw that Jack wasn't hiring a construction crew. "You're building this yourselves?" she asked one afternoon, her manicured nails glinting in the sun as she leaned against her car. Jack nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Just the two of us." Her smile tightened. "That's ambitious." She looked around at the piles of lumber, the wheelbarrow, the crooked line of temporary stakes. "Most folks hire professionals these days." Jack simply said, "We are professionals," and went back to his work. Evan tried not to laugh, but Jessica's expression when she turned to leave made it clear she didn't like being corrected. Word spread quickly along the street. The Millers, the newcomers, were building a house by hand. It became a kind of running joke among the wealthier families, something whispered during neighborhood barbecues and wine evenings. "They're doing it all themselves," someone would say. "No contractors, no architects. It'll collapse before the roof goes up." But Jack didn't hear the laughter, or rather, he chose not to. His focus was absolute. He and Evan set the foundation stones by hand, mixing cement in a rusted wheelbarrow, one batch at a time. They poured concrete under the soft glow of lanterns, their shadows stretching long across the field. Every nail they drove into wood sounded like a heartbeat, a steady rhythm that replaced all the noise from the world beyond. For Evan, those early weeks were the happiest he could remember. He learned to read the land, the texture of clay beneath his boots, the way a beam creaked when it was slightly off-center, the quiet power of patience. Sometimes, late at night, when the frogs sang by the creek, he would look at their half-built frame rising from the ground and feel as if they were creating more than a house. They were creating a promise. But the laughter from the neighbors grew louder. By midsummer, the shell of their house began to take shape, and with it came new reasons for ridicule. The lawyer, Brian Hall, would drive by slowly each evening, shaking his head. "They'll never pass inspection," he muttered once, loud enough for Evan to hear. Jessica Gray often waved from her porch with that same rehearsed smile, calling out, "Looks like a barn, boys. You sure that's the style you're going for?" Even Marilyn Fox, a retired TV host known for her gossip, joined in. "Poor things," she said to a friend one morning while watering her flowers. "They're trying to live the American dream with a hammer and a prayer." Evan heard it all. Each word sank into him like splinters. At night, he lay awake in the trailer, staring at the ceiling, wondering why people would mock something so honest. One evening, after a long day under the sun, he slammed his hammer into the dirt and turned to his father. "Why don't you tell them to shut up?" he said, breathing hard. "They don't know what we're doing here. They think we're fools." Jack wiped sweat from his brow, leaned on his shovel, and looked at his son with a calm that came from years of enduring. "Let them think what they want," he said. "Words don't build or break a house. Nails do." Evan frowned. "But it's not fair." "It doesn't have to be fair," Jack replied. "It just has to stand." And with that, he went back to work. The boy followed his lead, hammering again, this time with something harder in his chest. Not anger, but resolve. As the weeks passed, their progress became impossible to ignore. The frame grew taller, the roof began to take shape, and sunlight poured through the open skeleton of what would soon be walls. The smell of fresh lumber filled the air. Jack built everything from scratch: the window frames, the porch steps, the railing that would one day overlook the creek. He taught Evan how to measure rafters by sight, how to tell if a board was warped just by running a hand along it. In the evenings, after the day's labor, they sat near the fire pit eating beans and bread, their faces lit by the glow. Sometimes Jack spoke of the past of his own father, who had been a builder before him, a man who taught him that a true craftsman leaves a part of his soul in every beam. Other nights they sat in silence, listening to the hum of cicadas and the gentle rush of water nearby. Once, as the fire burned low, Evan said quietly, "When this is done, can we put a swing on the porch?" Jack looked at him, a flicker of pride softening his face. "We'll make it the strongest swing in the county." By late summer, the skeleton of their home had turned into a structure of substance. The roof was on, the siding nearly finished, and the windows framed perfectly square. Yet despite their progress, the neighbors' contempt didn't fade. Some were quietly jealous, others just didn't like being proven wrong. One afternoon, a storm rolled through Maple Hollow without warning. Thunder cracked across the hills, and rain came down in heavy sheets. Evan and Jack worked fast to cover their lumber with tarps, their boots sinking into the mud. Across the street, Brian Hall stood dry on his porch, shaking his head, as if watching two men waste their time. When the rain finally stopped, the miller's lumber was soaked, but their foundation stood strong. The following morning, while other homes had suffered leaks or gutter damage, their half-built house was untouched. Evan couldn't help glancing toward Brian's house, where a worker was already replacing shingles. That evening, as they ate dinner by the creek, the boy finally smiled. "They can laugh all they want," he said. "Our house didn't even flinch." Jack chuckled. "It's not a house yet," he said, "but it's learning to be one." By autumn, Maple Hollow was painted in copper and gold. The trees shimmered in the wind, and the air grew cooler, carrying the promise of change. The millers worked from dawn till dusk, pushing to finish before the first frost. The walls were up, the floors sanded, the porch ready for railings. Jack's hands were cut and rough, Evan's fingers calloused, but neither complained. The rhythm of work had become part of them now, as natural as breathing. Then, one evening in late October, the wind began to howl. It came suddenly, sweeping down from the mountains, bending the trees, and rattling the window frames. The radio in their trailer crackled with a weather alert, an incoming storm, stronger than anything the town had seen in years. The announcer's voice called it a freak event, the kind of wind that tore roofs from houses and sent fences tumbling into the creek. Jack stood in the doorway, listening. "We'll stay here," he said finally. "If it's bad, we'll move into the frame. It's solid." Evan looked nervous. "What about the others?" "They'll be fine," Jack said, though something in his tone was uncertain. As night fell, the wind rose to a roar. The rain lashed against their trailer so hard it sounded like stones. Jack grabbed his lantern, threw on his coat, and motioned to his son. "Come on," he shouted over the noise. "We're going to the house." They ran through the downpour, the ground slippery beneath their boots. The half-finished house loomed in the darkness, its silhouette sharp against flashes of lightning. Inside it was dim and cold, but the structure held firm. Jack barred the door, lit the lantern, and sat beside Evan as the storm raged outside. For hours the wind screamed across Haven Creek. Through the noise, they could hear things breaking. Trees splitting, shingles tearing loose, the sharp crash of something heavy falling nearby. At one point, a knock came at the door, faint but desperate. Jack opened it to find Brian Hall and his wife, soaked and terrified. Behind them were Jessica Gray and Marilyn Fox, their faces pale. Can we stay?" Brian stammered. "Our roofs are gone." Jack simply nodded and stepped aside. They crowded in, dripping water onto the bare floorboards. Evan watched silently as the people who had mocked them huddled now under the roof his father built. The storm raged until dawn. When it finally broke, the silence felt unreal. The world outside was soaked and broken, branches scattered across the street, fences flattened, the once perfect houses scarred and leaking. But the Miller's house still stood, its walls steady, its roof unbroken. Evan stepped outside and looked around. The creek was swollen, but the foundation was dry. Jack joined him, his face calm but proud. "Told you," he said quietly. "If you build it right, it'll stand through anything." Behind them, the neighbors emerged slowly, their eyes wide with disbelief. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. The sight said everything. The house they had laughed at all summer was the only one untouched. The boy looked up at his father, the morning light catching the damp wood behind them. "It's not just a house anymore, is it?" Jack shook his head. "No, son," he said. "Now it's proof." And as the sun broke through the thinning clouds, casting its first warm light across Haven Creek, their home stood tall against the horizon. Weathered, hand-built, and alive with the quiet strength of two people who never stopped believing that hard work, patience, and love could build something no storm could destroy. When the morning light finally broke over Maple Hollow, it fell on a town that looked like it had been through a war. The storm had rolled through the night like a beast tearing at the earth, and now, in its wake, everything lay damp and wounded. Branches littered the roads, fences were crushed, and pieces of roofs were scattered across lawns like discarded cards. The creek beside the Miller's land had swollen so wide that it lapped against the lowest steps of their porch. Yet, against all reason and expectation, the house that Jack and Evan had built with their bare hands still stood silent, strong, and whole. The wet boards gleamed faintly in the morning light, the nails catching glints of gold, as if the structure itself had absorbed the storm and come out shining. Jack opened the front door, stepping out carefully onto the porch. His boots sank slightly into the wet earth, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing in the smell of rain and sawdust. Behind him, inside the house, the neighbors stirred. Brian Hall and his wife were sitting on the floor, holding each other's hands tightly. Jessica Gray had fallen asleep on a stack of blankets, and Marilyn Fox was staring out a window, her expression dazed, her hair still damp. They all looked like people who had been forced to see something they didn't understand. Evan came to the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Is it over?" he asked softly. Jack nodded. "It's over." The boy stepped out beside his father, his sneakers squishing in the mud. Together they looked out over the neighborhood. From this higher ground, they could see the full extent of the damage. The houses that had stood in tidy perfection just yesterday were now wounded. some missing chunks of roof, others tilted slightly, their immaculate siding peeled away like paper. The lawns were buried in debris. What had been the pride of Haven Creek Drive now looked fragile, temporary. Brian stepped outside, his face pale, as he took in the sight of his own home. "God," he whispered, "I thought we built it to code." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The contrast between his modest, hand-built house and the shattered shells down the street said more than words ever could. He only glanced toward his son and gave a faint nod. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared, leaving behind a crisp blue that made the wreckage seem even starker. The neighbors, shaken and humbled, began returning to their properties, wading through knee-high puddles to inspect the damage. Jack offered them tools, nails, and spare boards. He didn't ask for thanks, and he didn't gloat. He simply handed over what he had and told Evan to help where he could. They started with Brian Hall's roof, which had lost half its shingles and a corner beam. Jack climbed up while Evan steadied the ladder below. The wind still carried the faint smell of wet cedar, and every now and then, a breeze would ruffle the boy's hair as he watched his father work. Steady, patient, unbothered by the height or the weight of the hammer in his hand. Brian stood below, watching, guilt heavy in his eyes. "I shouldn't have said those things," he muttered finally. "About your house. About you." Jack didn't look down. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Wind treats everyone the same." But Brian shook his head. "It matters to me." By the end of the day, the Millers had helped patch 3 roofs and reinforce 2 porches. Jessica Gray came over in the evening with a thermos of coffee and a pie, setting it awkwardly on their porch. "It's the least I can do," she said quietly. Her tone carried something new, respect. "Your house saved us." Evan smiled shyly and thanked her. Jack only nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Glad it could stand," he said. The next few days became a rhythm of rebuilding. News of the storm spread quickly through the county, and before long, people from other neighborhoods drove by to see the house that had survived. Some came out of curiosity, others with disbelief. A few shook Jack's hand and asked for advice. He gave it freely. How deep to set a beam, how to brace a roof, how to choose wood that flexed instead of cracked. Word traveled fast in small towns, and soon, what had started as whispers of mockery turned into murmurs of admiration. The local newspaper sent a reporter, a young woman with a notebook and wide eyes. She stood on the lawn, taking in the modest 2-story structure that looked like something out of another era, simple, functional, beautiful in its honesty. "You built all this yourselves?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Just me and the boy." She jotted something down, then looked up again. "No machines? No contractors?" "Just hands," Jack said, "and time." Evan, standing beside him, felt a quiet surge of pride. The reporter smiled and said she wanted to run a story about them, the house that didn't fall, she called it. Jack didn't care for the attention, but he agreed on one condition, that the story mention the value of building with care, not speed. When the article came out a week later, it carried a photograph of Jack and Evan standing in front of their home, sunlight spilling across the porch. The caption read, "Built by hand, stood by heart." The story changed everything. People began stopping by, not to laugh, but to learn. Some brought lumber or tools as gifts. Others just came to shake Jack's hand. The once hostile neighbors now treated the Millers as part of their own, a rare kind of family formed not by wealth, but by survival. Jessica organized a neighborhood cleanup, and Brian insisted on fixing the Millers' driveway as a token of gratitude. Even Marilyn Fox, who had always lived for gossip, wrote a letter to the local paper praising the men who reminded us what craftsmanship means. Evan noticed how different everything felt now. The same people who had avoided eye contact before now waved when they saw him in town. At the hardware store, the clerk gave him a discount for the Miller Miracle, as he called it. Yet Jack remained the same, quiet, grounded, uninterested in fame. "Let them talk," he told his son one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the creek return to calm. "Tomorrow, they'll talk about something else. But this," he gestured toward the house, "this stays." Spring arrived again before they realized it. The land around Haven Creek turned green and alive, wildflowers sprouting between the rocks. Evan planted a young apple tree near the front steps, marking the spot with a small wooden stake. "Mom would have liked this," he said, pressing the soil around the base with his hands. Jack looked at him and nodded slowly. "She would have." The tree stood small and fragile, but against the backdrop of their home, it seemed to belong there, as if it had been waiting all along. When Howard Collins returned a few weeks later, he found the property transformed. The modest house was finished, now painted a soft cream color. The porch railings polished, the windows framed with simple wooden trim. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. Collins stood by his car for a moment before walking up the path. Jack met him halfway, shaking his hand. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," he said. "I had to see it with my own eyes," Collins replied, looking up at the house. "I heard what happened. The storm, the neighbors, the paper. You made something special here, Jack." Jack glanced at the building, then back at the man who had made it possible. "We just built a home," he said. Collins smiled faintly. "No," he said. "You built a lesson." He paused, his gaze softening. "I gave you land, but you gave this town something better. Proof that hard work still means something." He stayed for dinner that evening. They ate on the porch, watching the last of the light fade behind the hills. Evan brought out lemonade and told stories about the storm, how they had huddled inside while the wind screamed, how the roof hadn't even creaked. Collins listened, clearly moved. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," he said. "Except I didn't have a father who taught me how to build." Evan smiled. "He's the best teacher," he said quietly. Jack chuckled but said nothing. He didn't need to. The pride in his eyes said it all. As dusk deepened, the neighborhood came alive with small signs of recovery. Lights flickered in windows, children played near the creek, and laughter drifted across the fields. The Miller's porch became a gathering place. People stopped by for coffee or advice, and Jack welcomed them without fuss. There was no bitterness in him, no need to remind anyone of the past. The storm had washed that away, leaving only understanding. One evening, as they sat together after everyone had gone, Evan turned to his father. "What will we build next?" he asked. Jack thought for a long time before answering. "Whatever needs building," he said. "Maybe a shed, maybe a bridge, maybe just another good day." The boy nodded, content. The night air was warm and smelled faintly of apple blossoms. Fireflies drifted lazily near the porch, their lights flickering like whispers. Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze tracing the stars overhead. "Dad," Evan said after a pause, "do you think this house will still be here in 50 years? Jack looked at the boy, his expression thoughtful. "If someone loves it enough to keep it standing," he said, "then yes. Houses are like people, son. They last as long as someone cares for them." They sat in silence after that, listening to the soft sounds of the creek. From somewhere down the road came the faint tune of a harmonica, the kind of melody that carried memories with it. It drifted through the trees, mingling with the rustle of leaves and the quiet pulse of water. As the moon climbed higher, Jack glanced toward the small apple tree at the edge of the yard. Its leaves shimmered silver in the light. "She'd be proud of you," he said softly, almost to himself. Evan smiled. Of both of us. When the lantern burned low and the world grew still again, the miller's house stood tall in the dark, its wooden frame creaking softly like a living thing. It wasn't the biggest house, nor the fanciest, but it was steady, honest, and filled with the warmth of hands that had built it, not for wealth, but for belonging. Around it, life slowly returned to Haven Creek, the hum of cicadas, the chirp of crickets, the promise of another sunrise. And so, in that small corner of Tennessee, a father and son who had once been laughed at became the quiet heart of a community reborn. Their home became a landmark, not for its size, but for what it meant. It was proof that even in a world chasing speed and convenience, there were still those who believed in patience, craftsmanship, and love. Years later, when the apple tree had grown tall enough to cast shade across the porch, people passing by would stop to rest beneath it. They would look up at the sturdy house on the hill and see the hand-carved sign near the door, the one Evan had made himself, now weathered but still clear. Built by Jack and Evan Miller, 100 by hand. And even after time had taken its toll, after the creek shifted its banks, after new families moved in and others moved away, the story of that house remained. It was told in the diner over morning coffee, whispered to children before bed, written into the quiet rhythm of Maple Hollow itself. A story of two builders who turned kindness into strength, laughter into silence, and a simple gift of land into a legacy that could never be washed away. Subscribe for more real stories like this one. Watch the next video to see what happens next, and share this story with someone who'd love it.